gentlemen, we're waiting for Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Calling our work session to order. First item of business is to share that Mayor Cowell, Councilmember Milton, and Councilmember Harrison are all absent and excused today. In today's meeting, we'll have a presentation from the Housing and Community Development Department to discuss a housing bond, and also a presentation from our Department of Transportation to talk about the transportation bond. So first up is Emma to talk about the housing bond. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Emma Sutton, Housing and Community Development Director for the city. I'm here with you all again today to talk about the 2026 proposed, oh, sorry, thank you. Is this better? Okay. So we're here with you again today to talk more about the proposed affordable housing bond. So we're going to talk a little bit about the state of the current housing bond, considerations for the next bond, and then talk some more in depth about recommendations. As a reminder, this is the third time we've talked about this, but we're going to talk a little bit more in depth. But since you all have seen this, I'm going to go through pretty quickly, and then I'll just take your questions. So the state of our current housing bond, as a reminder here, we had an $80 million bond that was passed in 2020 with a 5-year spending through fiscal year 26. So that provided $16 million over the 5-year period. So again, here you can see the different buckets that we had, what we call the bond buckets, or the different sort of activities under the $80 million bond, which were $68 million for housing development and preservation, $12 million for home buyer assistance and preservation, and those were really the primary two pieces of that bond. So in talking about some considerations for the next bond, we are looking at 4 years of resources versus 5. So it will look a little bit different as far as how much the overall bond is, and then again, those annual allocations. We really wanted to make sure that unit production was maintained from prior bond. So we looked at the average subsidy for bond-funded projects and then added around a 5% inflation rate to get to this calculation. And then we also wanted to incorporate funding for the unsheltered homelessness response strategy, which is now the Continuum of Care strategic plan. And finally, we wanted to recommend a one-time capitalization of at least $20 million to seed a mixed income development revolving loan fund. So here are our recommendations for the $101.5 million bond over 5 years. So we would have investments in, again, that housing development and preservation. And this category is really that engine that powers the pipeline of affordable homes being developed, 10.4 for home buyer assistance and preservation. And then we have 12 million for homelessness response and 21.5 as a one-time capitalization for the mixed income development. And we're just going to go into a little bit more depth on each of these. So here are those annual amounts that would go in each category, again, over that 4-year period versus last time it was a 5-year period. And note here again that 21.5 is a one-time capitalization for the mixed income development, but these annual allocations would be around 14.4 for housing development and preservation, 2.6 for home buyer assistance and preservation, and then $3 million for annually for homelessness response. So this range, again, is based on the average subsidy. And so you'll see that, again, there's that range of 160 to 510, and that is really dependent upon the cost of land. So in those higher cost, more urban core areas, you're going to see less units overall. And in the suburban, lower cost areas, you're going to see more units. So that is the range that we came up with from those estimates. And then for homebuyer assistance and preservation, you're looking at around 40 to 50 units annually. And again, that will keep us in a steady state. And then for homelessness response, that 125 could be, that number is specifically for rent assistance plus case management. Not everyone would need rent assistance and case management that is served under the COC strategic plan. So that number could also be homelessness diversion. And diversion runs around $2,500 per household. So you would see a lot more people served if those funds were used for diversion, homelessness diversion. And then for the mixed income development model, we estimate around 200 units every 3 to 5 years, and about a third of those would be affordable. So just going a little more in depth here, again, I told you how this range was sort of developed, and examples from this category include new affordable duplexes, rehab of city-owned houses, and housing and acquisition of NOAA properties. So also important to note that within that specific allocation area, we are contemplating a $500,000 allocation for pre-development assistance costs. So that would really help those sort of less established nonprofit developers, or it could be faith-based entities, to pay for sort of pre-development, preliminary design, engineering, consultant fees in order to help get the development off the ground. And we estimate around 5 to 10 projects to be served with that $500,000. So 10.4 and homebuyer assistance. This would include the owner-occupied rehabilitation in addition to the down payment assistance that the city currently provides. This range, the home ownership assistance range, is based on a $60,000 down payment assistance per unit for home buyers, and a $50,000 average subsidy for the home repair. So for homelessness response, this would fund partial I'm having trouble with this word. It would help implement the unsheltered homelessness response strategy, which is now under the Continuum of Care strategic plan. And so that would be partial implementation of that plan. And it would support decommissioning encampments by connecting people to housing and services. By doing so, it would help alleviate the shelter burden by reducing the need for that emergency shelter. And again, we could use these funds for rent assistance, homelessness diversion, case management, and overall to help coordinate a community-wide homelessness response, which is needed in order to fully deploy the COC strategic plan. So here's just a little reminder on a mixed income revolving loan fund. We are recommending an investment of bond funds into a revolving loan fund to make possible this mixed income model for Raleigh. The consultant that we worked with looked at some existing and theoretical city sites, including Raleigh Housing Authority's Heritage Park, as well as the city's DMV site. And investments from the revolving loan fund of approximately 10 to 25 million per project would be needed in order to make these mixed income communities possible. So, but as a reminder too, these funds would be paid back every 3 to 5 years. So this is creating perpetual affordability in mixed income projects. So in about a third of the overall units are generally going to fall within that affordable range. So for this investment, we estimate financing around 200 units, of which 140 would be market rate and around 60 would be affordable. And just a reminder too that these are Class A properties, so they're really high amenity, located in really desirable areas. And so it would be the one-time investment to fund and create it, and then again, the fund would operate in perpetuity. So that completes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Councilmember Branch?
Definitely, thank you for the work and the presentation. I know there's many that have sent us emails about why can't we go higher, how does, what number and everything. But one question I actually have, can you speak to how the AMI impacts how the money, goes into a project? Because my understanding is that the AMI changes every year by HUD, and with that number changing, and us not knowing what that number may be, that could impact. I may have answered my own question, but I'd rather, hear from you as our director.
Yes, that is exactly right, Councilmember. So that number does vary, and it also impacts the overall design of the project. So I think, we really tried to look at how do we keep a steady state, which is very much sort of a reasonable calculation, and looking at 450 units about per year. That would create, again, those gap funds for those 4% low-income housing tax credit projects. That is an increase overall from what we are doing now. So, and it is 4 years. So I think, versus 5, that's definitely an overall increase in our annual allocation, especially if you put it together with the penny. But I hope I answered your question. I digressed there a little bit.
No, you definitely did. And my other question really isn't for you. It's for our finance people, but I'm going to hear the second presentation before I ask that one.
Okay. Councilman Silver.
Thank you for the presentation, Emma. You noted that the number of units on an annual basis will depend on the cost of land and location. May be hard to answer, but for the last bond, do you generally know the split between, let's just say, urban, more, let's see, I don't want to say desirable locations, but more expensive locations versus less expensive? Because we often hear, you're overwhelming certain areas with affordable housing when it should be spread. And I know it's a balancing act, so can you tell us from the last bond, generally what was a ratio between the more expensive versus less expensive land?
That's a good question, and it's a little hard to answer. I think that primarily tax credit projects are driven by those lower cost areas because of the cost of land. So, if I were to sort of guesstimate, I would say there's probably a large number that were in those sort of lower cost areas because that's what's going to be allowed. That's what's going to allow those projects to pencil essentially and to be viable.
Yeah, I don't know from my colleagues because this is the first time approaching it, but you want to produce as many affordable housing units as possible, but then the public is saying, no, we want to be in a downtown location or a midtown location, which means there are less units. So it's a value judgment. So I just don't know what that trend was the last bond. So as we approach the new one, the question is location or production?
Right.
And so I think that's something we'll all have to decide. But thank you for sharing, that answer, even though I know it's very difficult to pinpoint.
Councilmember Patton.
Hi, Emma. Can you go to the slide with the unit production buckets? I know we talked about this before, but I guess I'm just like looking at it with fresh eyes, or you said it slightly differently than I heard it last time. So the 21 million for the new revolving loan, that approximately 200 is total units, and only 60 of them will be designated affordable.
So that's going to be one project, roughly. So in a mixed income project, typically you have a third of the units are affordable, and the rest of the units would be market rate. So for this investment, we would achieve the 1/3 of units from this project. However, again, because it's a one-time capitalization, you're looking at funds coming back into the fund to provide perpetual affordability in other projects ongoing. Does that answer it?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I'm just kind of looking at the far left for the tax credit projects and seeing that it's a smaller number that's going to produce more affordable units. And I just wonder about the calculus there. People will ask us, like, why not just dump all that money into the other bucket and get that many more units? Mm-hmm. And so can you draw that out for me?
Yeah, and it probably would have been helpful to have we had sort of a comparison map and we can provide that to you again, but it's a really good sort of side by side to show the advantages and I don't know disadvantages, but just to show the different aspects of each one. So for example, for 4% low-income housing tax credit gap financing, you're looking at, again, 160 to 510 units, going back to Councilmember Silver, with that trade-off of where the land is. Those are limited affordability, right? So a developer is signing up for a 30-year period for those to be affordable within certain ranges, so going up to 80%. And whereas with the mixed income capitalization, and again, that's like you're investing perpetually. Like, so you're continually every year, we have a certain number of projects that we provide funding for, and we get this number of units. Whereas with the mixed income development model, we are achieving a mixed income model, which I think has some policy benefits, right? I think we know that providing housing in those higher opportunity areas for folks is really important and has impact on overall health, future earnings, all kinds of things, well-being of people to sort of live in those mixed income developments. So I think there's that policy piece of it. And then also, again, you're creating that forever fund. So it's not year over year 14 million, it's one time 21.5 million versus year over year we're putting 14 million into those LIHTC properties for that 30-year affordability. We're looking at 21.5 one time, a third of the units are affordable. However, we're seeing money come back in the fund so that we can then recycle it and do projects year over year.
Okay. And then just one more follow-up on that. So the, Brad, an applicant's going to come and say, or we're going to pick a project that's a good match, and we're going to invest the 21 million that's going to produce some market rate units. Is the actual public dollars that they get going to just the affordable units, or is it like flexible, like it's going to pay for the pool or pay for the dog park?
So the market rate units are actually subsidizing the affordable units in those projects. So because you are able to get the higher rents for those market rate units, you're actually subsidizing the affordable units. It is publicly owned, so it's public ownership. And so that's maintained generally by a public housing authority and owned by a subsidiary of the public housing authority. Does that answer it?
Councilmember Jones.
Thank you so much. When we just had 2 cases that gave this money, payment in lieu of putting units on the ground, both with North Hills and with Peace and West. Would that money go into something like the pot for mixed income development? Where does that money go? Does that live in this account kind of thing, or where does that money go?
Would you ask that again?
Sure. So you've got the
Payment in lieu.
I said that payment in lieu, the payment in lieu that we got from North Hills.
Oh, I understand.
That money that whenever that comes to fruition, if it came tomorrow, let's just pretend it came tomorrow. Is that separate from what we're talking about here, or is that like the revolving fund? Would those funds go into there so that it grows that? Like I'm not sure how that money works.
It is separate right now. I think that council direction we would see what you all wanted to do. I don't know of any limitations of why it couldn't go into the fund if that's something that council wanted to do, but right now that is separate.
Separate. Okay. Thank you so much.
Any more questions? Thank you so much, Ms. Sutton.
Thank you.
Do you have what you need? This is the bond. I think it's just because we have to go to public hearings and all that other stuff. That's right. Yeah. Am I right, Mr. Raleigh?
Yes, Mayor Pro Tem Fort. We were just looking for general consent to proceed in this direction. That's all we're looking for at this point.
So now we will have the transportation bond presentation.
Good afternoon, council members. Kenneth Ritchie with Transportation here as a follow-up to a presentation you had during the retreat with some considerations on a 2026 bond referendum for transportation. Before I get started, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the amount of work that's gone into this from multiple departments to kind of look at where we've been and position ourselves for this conversation in terms of where some things to be forecasting for 2026 and beyond. So with our agenda, we'll discuss some 2026 bond considerations building off of the conversation that was had at the retreat. Also, too, building on that, we'll be looking at some advanced planning considerations, and this is really some considerations that would position us for investments with future bonds. And we'll get into more detail as we talk through that. So just a little bit of a recap from, I know many conversations on this, but the steady state that has been referenced with regards to the bond programming moving forward. So with this year, certainly looking at $203 million of capacity. I know 4 years has been the term that has been discussed. What we're looking at with this from a transportation standpoint is really using this to create cadence and to position ourselves to look at projects that we've got that we can deliver full construction on, but then also using parts of these programs to help position ourselves to build on those in the future and being able to create that cadence of funding using this kind of 4-year cycle that we've got. With the 2026 transportation portion of the bond conversation, We have targeted $101.5 million, so about half of that 203 for consideration. So as we look at a high level, we really got kind of three buckets that we have put together. Our first and the largest would be investment with bus rapid transit, and then some deferred projects from some of our previous bonds. The next bucket would be adopted plans. I'll go into more detail, but certainly most recently the adoption of the active mobility plan, the downtown mobility study, and we've got an additional plan that'll be coming forward to you soon. And then program areas that would encompass like our neighborhood traffic management program, and we'll get into more detail with some subsequent slides. And this just gives some examples. We are actually going to walk through each of these buckets in detail just to kind of discuss them and see. So as we look at bus rapid transit and deferred projects, we've got that bucket valued at about $51.5 million. This is really looking at projects that we have had substantial maturity on the design. We've been able to move those forward, or we've got investments upcoming that we know we're going to be able to expense and get these constructed within that kind of 4-year window. The big one here, Marsh Creek, Trawick, this is a 2017 bond project. Certainly, we've got a history on it. We'll walk through that too. Ebenezer Church Road, this actually dates back to the 2011 bond. There's some history there as to why it's still there, and we'll discuss that. And then certainly looking at our bus rapid transit, more specifically our southern corridor that will be coming online first, and some general purpose lane investment that we'll need to make there. So looking at our Marsh Creek Road and Trawick Road project, this is looking at enhancements from Capitol Boulevard to New Hope Church Road. There was a lot of discussion as this project came into, even into starting the project development, a lot of community conversations, and really looking at how do we right-size a project so that we're not overly adversely impacting the community there. There was a lot of focus on the Trawick Road section, heavy residential through that section, a much tighter corridor, and so we really looked at trying to targeted turn lanes to try not to have too much impact, but really looking at how do we make sure that we create safe accommodations for all users across this corridor with that connectivity between New Hope and Capitol Boulevard. And then certainly as we get to Marsh Creek, utilizing a lot of the footprint we've got, but really focusing on how do we enhance the multimodal accommodations and make the roadway safer so that we do have that safety for all users. A little bit of the timeline on this. So this project did initially come into conception with the 2017 bond referendum. In 2019, the design contract was awarded and work began. In 2022, as we started forecasting challenges with the implementation of the 2017 bond, funding for this project was initially deferred. And so at that time, the conversation was really how do we make sure that we've got this project positioned for potential investment with a subsequent bond. And so currently that project is about 65% design. We're right at the cusp of property acquisition, and that's kind of the timeline that we've got leading up to it. When we look at how it would play into a potential 2026 bond referendum, anticipating those dollars being available really in mid-2027, just based off the schedule. Final design acquisition would be completed within about a year. That would give us into 2 years of construction. So that final construction is actually construction completion. So we'd be looking at construction completion in fall of 2030. The next project is our Ebenezer Church Road project. This is and I'll get into a little bit more detail. This one has quite the history on it in terms of the evolution of this project, but really looking at an area of connectivity that originally was envisioned from Briar Creek Parkway to Leesville Road and then evolved into a connection into Umstead State Park, really providing that connectivity between the multimodal connectivity between those two, heavy residential to commercial, and then certainly as we get into it, understanding the resource that we've got with that connectivity to Umstead. So the timeline here, 2011 was the first bond that included funding for this project. That was originally for the Lumley and Westgate Road portions. So that would be that connection from Briar Creek to Leesville Road, was part of the Mountains to Sea Trail effort, which really is what kind of catapulted that forward. 2014 feasibility started. During that time and during conversations with the community, the Ebenezer Church Road portion was added to provide that connectivity into Umstead State Park. In 2019, a lot of conversations with external partners began. There was a lot of work. The runway expansion at RDU was coming into conversation, and knowing that would have an impact on the Lumley section of it. Also, conversations with Martin Marietta as they were doing their quarry expansion. There was a realignment of Westgate Road that happened as part of that, and then coordination with NCDOT, as certainly both the Lumley portion and the Ebenezer Church portion crossed through DOT facilities, through the interchange with Glenwood, and then certainly through through an intersection, signalized intersection with Glenwood. In 2020, that project was rescoped. It was rescoped to only be the Ebenezer Church Road portion. As we started to see costs escalating, certainly the priority was trying to keep it within the budget that we had at that time. And there was certainly a lot of interest from the stakeholders on the corridor about getting that connection into Umstead. And so with council support, that project was rescoped. And then in 2022, as some of those funding challenges continued, this was another project that construction was deferred, and that money was reallocated to help address gaps in other parts of the program. Currently, that design two is at 65%, and we're right at that pre-acquisition stage for that project as well. With this one, final design, final acquisition, we could anticipate this to occur really within the summer of 2027. There is still funding available within this project to help support some of this. And with the scope of this project, we're looking at about a year and a half timeline, so we would anticipate being able to construct this project and have it complete by the fall of 2028. And then the third portion of the BRT and deferred projects bucket is our Wake Bus Rapid Transit Southern Corridor, and this would be going to help supplement funding for the general purpose lanes. As y'all have been educated by our BRT team, as we come over South Saunders Street, the corridor will actually break off a little bit to the west, and we will have a parallel route to South Saunders that will carry the BRT. With that, there are general purpose lanes for our general vehicular traffic plan with that. That money is not federally those lanes are not federally eligible. So this would be essentially funding to help facilitate a potential obtaining of additional federal funding through other opportunities to help deliver those lanes. And with this corridor, what we're looking at, final design is the 2023 to 2027 timeframe. Anticipate with that final design, our federal grant agreement in 2027, which would position for advertisement in 2028 with anticipated revenue service and the corridor being complete in 2032. And just a note on that anticipated revenue service, that is contingent on federal project development process completion and the grant execution in 2027. So that is very much a time constrained, and certainly if the agreement pushes out, that likely does push that revenue service out as well. So as we get into our next bucket, looking at our adopted plans, this is really focused on our safety and what has been the moniker, the big jump that we shared with you during the discussions with our active mobility plan. What we're proposing here is $20 million to really help push forward that big jump. Additionally, $16 million for safety priority projects, and then $4 million that will be needed as we go towards our application for additional implementation funding through the federal government through the Safe Streets for All program. And I'll get into a little bit more detail there. A big piece of understanding with these adopted plans is that both the active mobility plan and the comprehensive safety action plan are really supplemental plans to each other. And there are a lot of overlaps between the two plans. So really this entire bucket will be going to really push forward on a lot of the priority projects we have, not only from a safety standpoint, but active mobility, because really in a lot of cases, we're hitting both with one project. So from our active mobility plan, the big jump, so 5 years looking at 5+ miles of new sidewalks and 50 miles of high comfort bikeways. So really looking at how we continue to push forward on giving those options, those transportation options for people that's not just a single occupancy vehicle. This is kind of that network map that was shared that really kind of shows the overall, both the sidewalks and the bikeways. I know this is small, and probably can be seen easier from PDFs. And then also shared during the adoption is really the prioritized sidewalk projects and the priority bikeway projects that have been identified with the active mobility plan, and certainly were the basis of your support that you provided us back in the fall. And then looking at our comprehensive safety action plan, and this is a little bit of a teaser because this plan will be in front of you all at your work session next Tuesday for a deep dive. Sean Driscoll, our Vision Zero program manager, will be doing a deep dive on the over 18-month effort that we've been working with the community and our consultant to kind of build our comprehensive safety action plan. Getting that plan in front of you, getting that plan adopted, then becomes the basis for us to go back and apply for implementation funding with the anticipation that there could be upwards of $20 million that we could potentially compete for to help us continue to push forward on our safety initiatives. A lot more detail coming on that next Tuesday. And then the final bucket from a program standpoint is really looking at two areas. Neighborhood traffic management, this is our traffic calming program, and then partnerships, looking at how we leverage our partnerships with DOT and certainly with potential private development partners to help us push forward on getting infrastructure on the ground as efficiently as we can. Just a little bit of a summary of the neighborhood traffic management. Annually, we have about 15 to 20 projects that we're trying to push forward. Implementation estimates between 1.25 and 1.5 million. So over that 4 years, that 6 million would help us continue the traffic calming program in the same capacity that it is today. And then certainly partnerships, looking at opportunities with NCDOT through municipal agreements with a lot of their projects to try and get additional infrastructure on the ground that would be over and above what they may require on their projects, and certainly looking at opportunities that we may have with private partners to get infrastructure on the ground to really take advantage of the opportunities that they have. So that's really kind of looking at what our initial programming is for considerations for a 2026 bond. I'm happy to stop there and take any questions. Really with the next piece of this conversation, it's talking through the advanced planning program that I think has been shared as part of the steady state that really is starting to forecast forward to future investments. So happy to take any questions.
Delvin, thank you for the information and presentation. For slide 17 and slide 16 and 17, can we get the, I know you have it on file, the actual streets and everything, because it's kind of, like you said, it's kind of hard to do it here. And then lastly, for the BRT general lanes, basically the $5 million is going to be used to leverage a different federal program to get those lanes. Is
Correct.
that okay? Is the Wake County Transit Plan putting any money into it?
I'm going to phone a friend here and I'll let Het speak to the Wake Transit Plan.
Because the general lanes are being added to support the Wake County Transit Plan.
Yeah, so the Hepatel, Transportation Transit, the general purpose lanes are not eligible for the federal funding under
Correct.
Federal Transit Administration. The Wake Transit Plan is supporting the local match for the entire project. So Wake Transit Plan is putting in upwards of $150 million into the project as a whole. We'll continue to monitor, again, what the costs are going to be for the general purpose lanes themselves and the opportunities, whether it's a different federal program or through the Capital Area Metropolitan Planning Organization, another pot of funding that we could try to leverage to make that happen.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, hi. I am struck that the two projects from the previous bonds are at 65% design. It feels like after a decade they would, like my instincts say they should be farther along. Perhaps there's a reason that you could help me understand.
So certainly with Marsh Creek and Trawick, we had gotten to that point right as the construction funding was deferred, and not knowing exactly what that timeline was going to be in terms of being able to get that project constructed, getting the project all the way through design, there's risk when it goes and sits for that long. So being able to stop at that logical point where you've got a pretty mature design, but still allows us the opportunity if we need to make tweaks to that project, it's not substantially costly and doesn't necessarily drag the design process out for another, say, 2+ years if we did that. So that's really why that one's at the stage it's at.
Okay.
In terms of Ebenezer Church Road, that one's gone through a number of evolutions. And so it's, again, that one, knowing how quickly that design can happen and as compared to like a Marsh Trawick, we didn't want to get that one too far ahead, running that risk too, until we knew when we would potentially have that construction funding to really deliver on it.
Got it. Okay. So you got it to that point, and then the funding ran out, and so you're just kind of like, okay, we're just going to put this back on the shelf, and that's why it's not more advanced.
Correct.
Okay. And the length of time, like the delivery period for the Trawick project is still 4 years if the bond passes. Is that the fastest it can be?
So I think part of it's going to be getting the funding that we'll need to be able to go purchase. So we won't be able to start acquisition, at least based off the funding that we have available right now, until at the earliest summer of 27. And so understanding that we're going to need to give ourselves some time to go acquire the property, that process can take anywhere from 6 to 18 months, depending on the number of properties. That kind of draws that out. And then certainly 2 to 2.5 years for construction. Trawick certainly is a very tight corridor, and that will be a very delicate construction project through there. There's also culverts that we're going to have to navigate with that project that likely will impact how quickly and the timing on getting construction completed.
And then just one more, and then I'll pass. Sorry. Switching gears, neighborhood traffic management, proposing $6 million under this proposal, and you said that maintains current capacity.
Yes.
Is the traffic management program currently a bond-funded program?
Yes. So most of the funding that the traffic management program has been using was programmed out of that 2017 bond.
Okay.
Over the course of the last, I think, 5 or 6 years is where you've really seen the number of projects tick up. And to that 15 to 20 projects, that really is the capacity of the resources that we have today within that program.
Okay. And in that capacity limitation, is it, it's like financial capacity only or human capacity? Like if the pot were larger, could you do more projects?
I think generally, yes, we'd have to do an assessment, but I think if there were additional resources, potentially, yes. But two, comes with that too is going to be the financial constraint. Certainly, the money we've got is going to be the money that we can deliver on.
Trying to frame the question properly. With this bond with steady state, there is no anticipated tax increase if the voters pass it. But I think all of us are still talking about, some of the issues about older projects that are now moving forward. There were 2 here. One you mentioned 2017, another one 2011. And so I have a 2-part question. One, as this goes out, once we decide what the transportation bond's going to be, and I believe we all support a transportation bond. I am still hearing a lot about Six Forks. I do know that there's a design that will be ready in the fall that will be somewhat modified. So how do we communicate those that are listening, some of those, Six Forks being one of them, some of the older projects that got bond funding that are either stuck in neutral, don't have enough funding, because we're now seeing 2. And can you just kind of give us an update on what to expect for Six Forks? It will not make this bond. We're now looking at 2030, which means the public, with all the development, may not see any improvement until the mid-2030s.
So certainly we've had a lot of conversations on Six Forks over the last few months. I know one thing that came up during Transportation and Transit was, okay, what about the potential of a multi-use path along the corridor? We've run some estimates. We're estimating somewhere in the $40 million range just to do a multi-use path down one side of Six Forks Road from Millbrook down to and into the North Hills area. The challenge we've got with Six Forks is really the real estate component of that conversation, and being able to get a multi-use path is going to require us to go acquire property. And so it's balancing that. Certainly, if there was will from the council, I think obviously yes, it'd be pushing it out to potentially 2030. We could start diving into a little bit more of that as we prepare start working on a design if that was the will of the community and the council for us in preparation for 2030. But I think anything that we look at, based off our assessment, anything we look at along that Six Forks corridor and in the Midtown area is going to be a substantial investment.
And my other question is just to prepare us for the public, because I don't know how many 2011, 2017 projects are still on hold, and just want to be able to communicate, because I know the Parks does it in terms of, here are the bonds, here's the status, that would be very helpful. I just know in my district, one that people are very, very vocal is Six Forks, but I'm sure my colleagues have others that are in their district. So I'm grateful for Ebenezer Church and Marsh and Trawick that those are moving forward. But I think it'd be helpful just to know some of the others so we can communicate it's important to pass these transportation bonds, even though there may not be one in your district.
We're committed to providing that same transparency moving forward as the precedent has been set with the Parks bond. And certainly with some of those previous projects, we can provide that as a follow-up, just information on those.
Yeah, there's more of a response that might be helpful. One thing we talked about in transportation and transit is that, it's a funnel on Six Forks Road, and at the bottom of it is 440. And the Six Forks Road project would have opened to the top of the funnel, but not done anything to the bottom of the funnel. So even if it had proceeded, it might not have really produced a measurable level of comfort for residents, but that the multimodal bridge project is really what's going to provide like an alternate. It's going to pull the local traffic apart from the commuter traffic, and so that project is likely to deliver a little more comfort. And so maybe turning to you, the question is, can you speak to timeline of the multimodal bridge? When's design? When do we go for the federal grants? What's our local match looking like? All asterisks, but. Yeah.
So the current state on that, as you will recall, with the consideration of the Six Forks project, when that one was canceled, essentially you directed $3.5 million to that to move forward with design, and that was paired with another $500,000 that we had programmed in a previous year's CIP. So we are actively working on that design and really trying to move that to that kind of through that conceptual design phase, so we can get essentially an educated estimate on what it may cost to deliver that project. And then certainly I think as we start to identify what that looks like, coming back for conversations with the council on, okay, what does the funding look like here? It probably would be a pretty substantial impact on an annual CIP from a match standpoint, but it is the target. I think certainly could be that if there's a will to continue forward with that project, once we understand what the estimates are, to try and position it for a 2030 bond referendum based up with the funding that have already been allocated from the council.
I can't be. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. On that note, it would be I'm trying to come to words about a timeline. Will you be ready for a local match in 2028?
Possibly.
Okay.
I think, assuming we don't hit any major roadblocks as we work through the design, it's possible. Certainly our goal is to try and move that design forward as quickly as possible, because we know that as we look to potential federal grant pursuits, there's no given there. And so we really want to make sure that we give ourselves some leeway there. So certainly we're trying to move that design forward as quickly as possible.
I'm just thinking about, like, if we go for the federal grant and we get that in 2028, but then we have to sit on our hands for 2 years until 2030 to run a new bond. I'm just wondering if there's some strategy to running a bond in 28 so that there could be inclusion of the multimodal bridge match in like a 28 bond. So like if we didn't, this maybe is switching back to the council, what we've been offered here is that out of the $200-ish million, it's like a 50-50 split between transportation and housing. And we're using up all the available capacity now, and so we don't have anything newly available until 2030. If we didn't use it all up, then we could run something again in 28. Like if we left some available.
Can I? So if I go back to some previous staff presentations, I think what we're here today is we have bonds before us that do not raise taxes. And I think at some point we will have to do some bonds that will require a property tax increase. And that will probably involve more projects throughout the city, as well as, giving us a number. And again, I was going to wait until the end, but if you can come down, can you speak to the bonds that were presented to us? Because I think it was go every 4 years with these bonds that don't raise taxes, property taxes. But in between, there could be another almost every 4, every 6, whatever the cadence is of a bond that does raise taxes. And let me know if my recollection is incorrect.
Allison Bradshaw, Finance. Yes, I think everything that you just summarized is correct. So at the retreat, we talked about having $203 million available for this fall. And of course, we've been talking housing and transportation. You have the option every 2 years, really, to put a bond on. You will also recall the 203 covers both our voted GO debt, which we typically do housing, parks, and transportation, but that really also needs to cover our limited obligation bonds, which, council member, you may have been referring to, which is really the city infrastructure that goes on as well. So I do think, as we've previously shared, there will be some tough decisions in front of council relative to our capacity and the timing, but the feedback from council was to sort of size this every 4 years. So hopefully that addressed your question.
And hopefully that kind of helps. It kind of leads to, I think the biggest goal and what I'm getting from your comments is, how do we get the money to complete the projects that we say the community says they would like to see, which includes this multimodal bridge, also includes some projects I know in my district that residents have been asking for as far as sidewalk and road widening improvements that are not cheap. The fact that just to put asphalt down to go, how on Six Forks Road, for that $40 million, what's the distance?
That's roughly a mile.
So $40 million for 1 mile of just for pedestrian bikes, that's a very difficult conversation.
Yeah, and that wasn't my suggestion.
Yeah,
so.
I know that one wasn't, but I'm just putting that in the whole totality of all of our projects that we're thinking about. I agree. I like the multimodal project because I think it'll take pressures off of Six Forks Road. The question is, how can we get there and still be mindful of our taxes? And these bonds don't raise taxes. We as a council, we could sit here and decide, hey, we want to do these projects. We want to do them sooner. Staff will give us a number and say, this is what it will cost, and this is the tax increase. But that's something that we will have to give staff the direction for.
And maybe for Allison, I don't know that our direction was, well, every 4 years we'll run a bond with no tax increase, and in the middle years we'll run one with tax increase. That's not my memory of the conversation. But Allison, the $203 million of debt capacity, if we say only ran $150 million of bond this time, that other $50 million could be used for the LOB projects, or would still be available in 28. We could run another bond with no tax increase with it in that size. Is that right?
Yes, in broad brush terms, sort of the 203 is available today. If the decision is to not go to 203, that capacity remains, and then you can look for either a bond in 28 or to fill the rest with those limited obligation type city investments that are out there as well. We know we just got the fire master plan, et cetera. So I think to answer your question, yes, the capacity sort of gets held off to the side, for lack of a better term.
And is there a moment when we'll know more about like those lob projects, like the fire stations, like if it was the desire to catch all of the things that need debt in the 203? Like, I don't think I know how big that bucket is.
Sure. So Ryan Bergman, City Manager's Office. So when we started the steady state transition, we knew that it was going to be done over a number of years. We certainly weren't going to be able to do it in one bond cycle. So we were fortunate that with the property tax and sales tax that we have now, we are able to have $203 million in capacity at a time when we're not looking to do a parks bond. So really what we set up is $203 million to look at housing and transportation, which when you go to the voters in November, you can say, if you say yes, there will not be a tax increase. And then in 2030, you would also have $203 million, barring any changes in revenue and things like that that occur, for you to make decisions then. But each year, you do have options. So if you get to 2028 and you decide that you want to do a parks bond or you want to do an additional transportation bond, you would have flexibility to do that. It's not as simple as just saying, raise taxes and do this. The $203 million in 2030 might become $80 million if you did it a little bit earlier in 2028. It essentially is a different model that you would need to run. But I do want to make sure that we don't gloss over the advanced planning part of this, in that those are decisions you don't need to make today or in this bond cycle. With advanced planning, you do have the flexibility beyond this budget to move a project like the bridge or something else that you really want to get ready and see naturally if it becomes something that you might be ready for in 2028, or if it's something that would need additional time to 2030, if that kind of makes sense. As far as fire, we know with the fire master plan that we're going to have to get into a cadence of significant additional stations that we're certainly not resourced for now. So we were able to put a couple into advanced planning this past year, the top priorities in the fire master plan. And when we get real estate accomplished and we get those designed, then those would come forward for funding from council.
Any more questions? Another part of your presentation.
Yes. So Ryan kind of did another lead up for me. But the other part is, as Ryan referenced, advanced planning and looking at how we start to position ourselves with some incremental investment to start to identify what those costs may be for some strategic investments that position us for subsequent bonds as we think about those into the future. As you may recall from the February 3rd, there was an allocation and appropriation within the mid-year memo that essentially identified $18 million from capital reserves for this advanced planning, and really looking at how we could position ourselves for those future investments. So these were shared at the retreat, and certainly we can talk through them in a little bit more detail. But 4 potential advanced planning candidates that we are looking at here. One would be associated with the big jump, mobility and safety. This actually would allow us to not only start positioning projects in the immediate term to help support the 2026 bond, but certainly would help us continue to move that movement forward for future implementation funding that would be necessary to deliver on the big jump and really that entire plan, both those plans. The Capitol Boulevard Corridor Study preliminary design. This is one, we've got a strategic opportunity with potential bridge replacements to try and look forward to the fruition of a 2012 corridor study for Capitol Boulevard, and this is really in that area of Atlantic Avenue. Southern Gateway implementation. There's a lot of activity that's going on between City Gateway, that's kind of in that northeast quadrant of that intersection, activities at Heritage Park that really are giving us the opportunity to kind of look at that whole intersection. How do we try and make those movements and that design more urban as we really look at really the density from downtown is starting to move a little bit further to the south. And then some potential advanced acquisitions along a future extension of Tryon Road, where we're starting to see some heavier development, certainly within our neighbors in Garner, that have really kind of brought that to the top. So with the $2.5 million for the big jump, really this is the aggregation of the downtown mobility study, the active mobility plan, and our Safe Streets for All, which you'll hear more details about next week. But really looking at that investment to allow us to really start moving those designs forward and positioning those so that we can really maximize as much construction as we can to get on the ground as quickly as possible. With our Capitol Boulevard corridor transformation, this is really kind of the fruits of the vision that came from that 2012 corridor study, which really looks at a consolidation of Capitol Boulevard, both northbound and southbound, on what is today the southbound alignment. And then what that allows is it allows the existing northbound alignment to become part of our local street network. More importantly, to that, it really opens up the space between what would be Capitol Boulevard and a local street extension to reset that into its natural form, and really in kind of concert with a lot of the Sponge Cities principles, really allowing us to set a natural place to try and help mitigate some of the stormwater concerns that we're seeing. It also provides opportunities in partnership with parks to create some activated space in this area as we look for this area to continue to grow in the decades to come. The third would be Southern Gateway implementation. As I highlighted, as you can see with the kind of teal color there, substantial development activity that's occurring really on the north side of the western Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard corridor. And what this would allow us to do is continue that design forward as we are working in concert with these two developments to make sure that we've got a design that's going to work and really does help to build on the vision that was for the southern corridor. And really, as we know, I think it will help with some of the congestion that we've seen in the area, because you will start to see some more natural points of start and platooning that will help, I think, actually will benefit the flow of traffic as we think to downtown, and really hopefully slow it down as we are coming into this area. And then the final one is our Tryon Road extension and advanced acquisition, and I will focus on kind of the three parcels that are highlighted there in yellow. Those are in Raleigh's jurisdiction. These have come to light in coordination with Garner. They've got a tremendous amount of development that's happening in this area right now. One property that is kind of just to I'll call it southeast of the yellow properties, and then larger properties that are beside that. Habitat for Humanity is building roughly 1,000 rooftops right there in that area in Garner. Garner's got development that is happening right there just to the southwest of Creech Road. And certainly we see this corridor continuing that trend with what we're seeing in Garner, and likely with the growth that we're seeing in Raleigh coming. And so really trying to make sure that we've got ourselves, because with those three parcels in particular, putting a street on them essentially is the property, with very limited, if any, remnant property that could be developable. So we understand that as we look at these, property is never cheaper than it is now, and the longer that we continue with some of these things. So it's really looking at a strategic acquisition to really protect ourselves as we look to the future. But with these four advanced planning candidates, depending on feedback today, we would bring those back at a future regular meeting for support on leveraging some of that advanced planning funding to help move some of those efforts forward. And as we referenced, would really try and position a lot of those efforts similarly to what we're doing with the Midtown Bridge for consideration of those larger investments as we get into subsequent bond conversations.
Councilmember Silver.
Thank you so much. Always enjoy planning, and advanced planning is even more advanced and better. I said this before, but very intrigued by all the proposals. The Capitol Boulevard, just want to make sure there is close coordination as we're looking to the 2050 comprehensive plan about the land use, transportation land use go together. And I focus a lot on the Sponge Park, very important, on the alignment of Capitol Boulevard. Very pleased that 2012 Capitol Boulevard study is still being looked at, but just want to make sure that I fully understand the land use implications because it's unlocking a lot of potential and just want to understand that as well. I know it's your transportation, not planning, but certainly want to make sure, don't know the conversations you're having with planning, but to me, I think it's very critical that we tie those two together, both the open space, the land use, but also the transportation improvements.
Planning is very much at the table as we're having these conversations, understanding what that potential becomes as we look to see this forward.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the work. I do agree that Creech Road connection is probably needed sooner than later, so I'm glad we're seeing the planning for it. Which leads me to my next question, which will probably come back to Allison as far as financing. So we plan it. We go out and we do everything, and I went back and pulled the retreat presentation of the 203 kind of spaced out every 4 years. My question is, I have many questions, but I'm gonna start with this one first. Are we limited, how much are we limiting the number of projects we can do by splitting the 203 between housing and transportation? And that may be a Evan question.
So Councilmember Branch, I think we might ask you to clarify that a little.
So right now, the 203, 203 million is the number that we've been provided that we can do that does not raise taxes. So we're splitting that almost roughly in half, 101 to 101 between housing and transportation. We have more than $100 million worth of needs in both categories. So if we're going every 4 years and we're doing the 203, my question is, will we need to do something in between these 4 years, or do we have the capacity to do something because we have more projects than we have resources?
Yeah. So, and I probably will defer again to our CFO to weigh in. I think kind of going back to what Ms. Bratcher shared earlier, what we've modeled now essentially contemplates $203 million every 4 years without a tax increase. We can take that on without asking the voters for additional revenue to support that. So if we were to contemplate interim, between those 4 years, interim bonds over and above the 203, that certainly would change that picture. And I think it would also impact what the steady state number would ultimately be. That 203 would be something different. I can't say exactly what it would be, but it'd be something different every 4 years if you were to do a bond, for example, in 2026 or 2032 or in those off years, in between years. So, and as far as impact on projects, certainly there are a lot of needs. And obviously, any amount of additional revenue to support those needs will advance those projects that we've laid out, but may not necessarily have the resources today to help. I don't know that I can put a specific sort of number. If there was a specific category of projects that you were thinking about, how much, how many more resources would we need to do X, Y, or Z, we could certainly provide that for you. If you wanted, if council was interested in seeing what some potential new configuration of the allocation of that 203, what it would yield, where we would, from a staff perspective, propose changes to be made, we can certainly do that if that's the will of the majority. But I hope that
you're getting there, kind of helps. And I guess this is the question that would be helpful. 203 every 4 years, that's what was in the presentation.
Correct.
If we were to do something in between, so within that next year that we were supposed to do 203, that availability number would be lower. Would that be a true assessment?
Essentially, yes. I mean, that's one way to think about it. Also at the retreat, we did talk about what a property tax increase would look like and how much capacity that would add. So a half a penny would add around $48 million to that number. A penny would add $93 million, and we also sized a penny and a half. which would be about 136 million. So you can definitely see, I think, to Mr. Raleigh's point, the financial capacity, right, increases pretty greatly with simply more revenue, right, dedicated to this, these projects. I certainly can't speak to the capacity of staff, right, to be able to do all that. I think that's something we would weigh as well.
Okay.
But, all this is just purely, general timing, right?
Correct.
And so to the point earlier, this is what we'd modeled. We can go back and, run other models. Certainly if you'd like us to show what, every 2 years would look like, it would change the number because essentially you're bringing on, that debt sooner. And so in theory, you're reducing that capacity.
Okay. You're right. Oh, I didn't know if Ryan was going to say something.
So just going to add, I was able to work pretty closely with housing and transportation on this project. So let me speak a little bit about both. On the housing side, we were able to discuss a number when we talked about what does half of our capacity look like to them. And maybe the easiest way to describe it is comparing the bond funds we have annually now to what we would have under this is a 58% increase in the bond funds. So it is a pretty big deal when you look at it from annual resources on the bond side and what they're able to do. And then on the transportation side, sure, long-term, it's probably a little lighter than what the 2030 bond should probably look like when we get to that point. But the starting point when you get there will be 203. It won't be zero, which is the advantage of the steady state. So you can build off of that. But trying to go significantly bigger now could be problematic when you consider that everything we're trying to do is set up this pipeline with advanced planning for the big named projects. And outside of some of the programs, if you added another $100 million now for some of the projects, there's a good chance that they're going to spend a couple of years being designed and planned anyway, and then get into the next stage, land acquisition. So that's why we were comfortable with the recommendation at the level that it is.
So I'm good with where we are and where we're going. Like, I recommend we move forward. My reasoning for asking the questions is kind of set the ground for the future.
Yeah.
And where we're going and what's actually available. And because the decisions we make today impact those future decisions as far as bond capacity. So that's my reasoning for asking the questions, to try to level set and know what's there, and the fact that there may be a point in 4 years where we do 203 is the baseline, but then we do add another half penny or another penny on top of that, depending on the number of projects. And the reason why I'm bringing this up too, because I know the last transportation bond is like, between the 5 districts, every district had like 3 major projects. So, you're looking at that number, and then you're looking at this, and we're talking about 3 projects. So that was my reasoning. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry to really beat a dead horse, but take me through it once more. So these are all the GEO projects, but the LOB projects, they're all in advanced planning now. So someone's drawing up drawings for the new fire stations, and we're paying some amount of money to get those drawings so that we'll have a more precise estimate of how much like the new fire stations will cost when they're ready. But then once we've got those, we have to fund them through the LOB debt, and that has to fit in the 203, or we're going to have to do a general tax increase through the budget process to afford them.
Yes. So the 203 was sized to say, what is the capacity that we have? And that number is currently the 203. And actually, I don't know if I could go back to the very first slide of Kenneth's, but that number represents both our voted as well as our limited obligation. So to answer your question, we need to fit all of that in 203 without a tax increase, and that becomes the challenge before council and staff, quite frankly, about how that gets managed. The idea is, as Ryan just spoke to on that advanced planning, that is there to say when we're ready to go to the next phase, we have tighter estimates, right? We have those drawings. We essentially know what we're getting into, which then helps us be able to communicate better to the public as well as council. We truly now believe this is the cost to now go implement these said things.
Okay. So just, I guess, to say again to the council, like what we're saying is if we use up all this debt on these two topics, when it comes time to support some of those other things, that's going to be a general tax increase. So we just need to be doing that affirmatively.
And just to maybe add one thing, this was also on the slides at the retreat. I did just want to say both City Hall, kind of heavy equipment shop, Fire Station 1315 and Police Evidence Building are already included, so they're outside of the 203. So at least just want to sort of say that out loud. Those were previously approved and funded projects. So they are already in the model, already taken care of outside of the 203.
But future projects would not be included. So if you have Station 23 or, a different station that you already mentioned, that is not already included. So we would, right?
That would need to fit in the 203 without a property tax increase, yes.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
So when we talk about the fire master plan, it's important to note that there's capital costs and there's also significant personnel costs, just like the staffing study with police and ECC and some of the other departments. So next week, the county tax assessor is going to come in and not tell you guys great news, which we of course hinted at the retreat. So I don't want to create the impression that we're not going to have needs in the budget. There are certainly going to be needs, and we'll have to make decisions on things like the fire master plan and the staffing study.
Any more questions?
Just no questions. Just comments. I would say, I think I'm a little bit challenged to sort of give a check mark at this moment for this size and this split. I think one, we're under a lot of pressure from our taxpayers that they're facing affordability issues at every turn, knowing that we're going to have these other debt needs that they're not accounted for here. So we're affirmatively saying we're just knowing that we'd have to do a tax increase for those. And on the flip side of the same coin, we have a lot of residents asking us for a transformational housing bond, and knowing that this is falling short of their request. So I, at least for myself, I wouldn't necessarily feel great about giving a check mark at this moment, and would prefer to ruminate a little more, ask more questions privately, and see you back another time.
So you said we're getting another presentation next week, correct?
Yeah, at your council meeting on March 17th, Marcus Kinraid, who is the tax administrator for Wake County, will be coming to talk about really the current state of property taxes, which, as Ryan said, is not the position that we expected ourselves to be in. You might remember at the retreat, we talked a lot about the low and moderate income applications that were coming in. We've talked about brownfields. We talked about appeals still at the Property Tax Commission. All of that is painting a very different picture for I'll just say our FY27 base that we're starting with for property tax. So he's going to come. He did a very similar presentation to the county commissioners, and we felt it important for y'all to hear directly from him some of the pressures out there on our property tax, which again, largest revenue source in the general fund.
So, Mr. Raleigh, it sounds like we don't necessarily have consensus to move forward today, and it may be beneficial for us to hear that presentation before we're in a position to give you or staff some guidance, and then that would give you an opportunity to get your additional questions answered. So I don't think we can take any action today, but maybe after the next meeting and we get that presentation, we may be in a better position to move forward.
And that is fair. That's exactly what we were looking for, is a kind of a consensus around the bond package that we've proposed, the size, both the size and the components of it. And so if there is not consensus, we will absolutely welcome additional questions, recognizing that we do still have some runway to be able to potentially make changes. I know that we are approaching the time in April where we would need to finalize a plan around what, if the council wishes to proceed with the bond issue, what the components of it will be and the size. So please, certainly if there are questions, whether they're shared now or immediately following the meeting, we would welcome those to get some specific insight into what questions you feel like you need to have answers to before feeling comfortable, giving your full blessing to the staff proposal or something different. So we just ask that those questions come in a timely fashion so that we can put that together.
For me, and I'll only speak for me, is it possible to schedule a meeting to where I can ask those? From what came up today, I think I'm a little bit more confused than I was when I walked in. So if I can do that instead of you waiting for an email from me, if we can just schedule a meeting, that way I can say all the things and you don't have to wait. Make sure that you get your answers in a timely fashion.
Sure.
Anything else from anyone else? Okay. All right. Well, this concludes our work session, and we will reconvene tonight for public comment at 7 p.m. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.